All right, so we ended lecture on Monday talking about how per capita grain consumption, per capita grain production has started to level up, but might and has actually started to decline from about 1980 until 2010. So we were asking ourselves why, and some of the major reasons are that just because food exists and is plentiful doesn't mean that everyone has access to it. If you can't afford food, doesn't matter how much there is, you're not going to get it. Um, and also, if there's a lack of adequate food supply to people, even though there's a lot of it, if the supply isn't being sent to the people, then overnutrition, undernutrition can still be a problem. Poor governance can also lead to lack of adequate food supply. And also, the fact that about 40% of the grain that we grow is given to livestock um, is a big factor in why undernutrition is still prevalent in most of the or has gone up in the world. Most corn and soybean grown in the United States are used to feed livestock and poultry. And if we remember back to when we were talking about trophic levels, right? From an energy standpoint, if there's 10,000 joules of energy in producers like corn and it was fed to a primary consumer, this time being people, well, then that's 1,000 joules of energy available to feed people. And if we feed that to livestock, well, then that makes it so that only 100 joules of energy are available for people. So if people ate producers rather than primary consumers, it is possible that more food would be available to more people. But like we mentioned earlier, just because there's more food available doesn't necessarily mean it will get to the proper to get to the people. So let's go back to this. Why is grain per capita grain production decreasing? Well, another idea is that production is not keeping up with population growth. If we want this to go up, what do we need to do? So if we want per capita grain production to not decrease, what do we need to do? Well, there's only really a few options. One option is that more land can be put into crop production. Another is to develop strains or somehow figure out how to improve crop yields, meaning more food per unit of plant grown. Another idea would be to reduce meat consumption, making more food available per person. And probably it's going to have to be a combination of all these methods. In order to understand what we can do, we must examine the current farming methods and their cost and benefits. So this is something we've already talked about. But the abundance of food, uh, if you take a look, oh sorry, the this graph is showing global population on the dark blue axis, and then we have reactive nitrogen, which is basically nitrogen, how much nitrogen we've been uh, we've been producing over the years. And as you can see, it was both relatively low. And then when the Haber-Bosch process came around, the amount of nitrogen we were allowed to produce from fossil fuels and industrial nitrogen fixation started to rise. And combined with the already natural nitrogen fixation, the rate of nitrogen fixation increased, and along with that, also increased the human population. Because nitrogen is a limited nutrient for plants, once we figured out how to make this limiting nutrient available to plants, we were able to grow lots of food. And once we grow a lot of food, we have then increased our population exponentially. So food production makes a positive feedback loop. The more food we produce, the more people there are, and the more food, then the more food we need to produce to feed more people. So it's another example of a positive feedback loop. Today, the type of farming that we have is more mechanized and relies on fossil fuel. Uh, and this is what we call industrial agriculture or agribusiness. It's way different than what you think of when you think of like old McDonald's farm. This is the type of farming that's done the majority of the planet today. It relies heavily on fossil fuel and was spurred on after the Industrial Revolution. Industrial agriculture, this type of agriculture depends on energy. It used to depend on mostly human energy, and now it depends a lot on fossil fuel energy. And to understand this concept a little bit better, we have to understand the idea of the energy subsidy. So the energy subsidy is the energy input per calorie of food. As you can see, the energy subsidy, or the amount of energy we put in per unit of food, is much greater today with than with traditional agriculture, so small-scale agriculture or small-scale farms. So traditional agriculture uses human energy. Modern agriculture uses fossil fuel energy. So how do we interpret this diagram? And I would interpret this. This will show up again on a quiz or a test. Think about this. So here we are. Here's the feedlot beef. It's about maybe 15, a little bit less. That means there's 15 kilograms of grain are used to produce 1 kilogram of beef. So that's an energy subsidy of about 15. So compare that to chicken. If you look at large-scale eggs or for chicken, we got about 2.8. So it takes only 2.8 kilograms of grain to produce 1 kilogram of chicken. So as far as energy efficiency goes, it's a lot more energy efficient to produce eggs than it is to produce feedlot beef. This is to show us that food choices are energy choices. But we don't just use grain energy to make food. So what types of other energy is needed to get our food to our table? Well, there's fossil fuel for transportation, fossil fuel to make pesticides and fertilizers, fossil fuel to pump water for irrigation, and fossil fuels to operate tractors. So once again, food choices are energy choices, especially in today's modern agribusiness era. So take a look at the U.S. diet in 1950 and compare it to the U.S. diet in 2010. So as modern agribusiness technologies have taken off, the amount of energy it takes to sustain a typical U.S. diet has increased from about 5 units of energy per one to feed us to now it takes about 10 units of energy to produce 10 kilocalories to produce 1 calorie of energy for a typical U.S. diet. So take a look at hunting and gathering down here. Hunting and gathering is less than 1. So what does that mean? Well, that means we get more energy from consuming the food than we put into acquiring that food. So that means when we put 0.1 unit of energy into getting food, that we got one unit of energy from that food. So that means that we were actually not expending more energy to get the food than when we actually ate it. So energy subsidy of 1, so this is coastal fishing. Energy subsidy of 1 means we're pretty much balanced, right? It takes 1 unit of energy to get the fish, and when we get the fish and eat it, we get 1 unit of energy back, so that's balanced. So how did we get from, as a society, right, long time ago, hunting and gathering, typical U.S. diet in 1950, and then the typical U.S. diet in 2010, the energy subsidy, the amount of energy is taken to give us food is starting to increase. And how did we get to this point? We got to this point through what's called the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution is not buying eco-friendly things. The Green Revolution refers to an agricultural type of revolution that came into being in the 20th century, when agricultural systems changed dramatically from small farms relying on human labor and little fossil fuel to large farms with less people and more machines. There were new management techniques introduced, more mechanization, and then what we call the triad of fertilization, irrigation, and improved crop varieties. All these things coalesced into what is known as the Green Revolution, and in turn increased food production. Norman Borlaug was an American crop scientist. He won the Nobel Prize for his agricultural techniques. He developed, with some other scientists, some new strains of wheat and higher yields of disease-resistant crops, plus using fertilizer and irrigation in a new way that allowed more food to feed more people. And this took place in about the 1950s and 1970s. His techniques was adapted globally between the 1950s and 1970s. So, more people fed was probably a factor that led, so during the 1950s and 1960s, so around right about this time, as you can see, this is the graph for undernourishment. As you can see, between 1970 and 1997, like we saw before, the amount of undernourished people started to decrease. So more people fed was probably a factor to less people being undernourished. But eventually this led to more people, which needed more food, which may have led to the increasing rate of undernourishment from 1996 to 2009. So let's go into some of the practices following the Green Revolution. First one is mechanization. So machines allow for large farms producing one staple crop to be more productive than small farms. Uh, this is where we introduce this idea of economies of scale, where the average cost of production fall as output increases. So this is a harvester, and as you can see, this probably is really expensive. But if you pay $150,000 to $400,000 for a new harvester, even though that's a large upfront cost, it's useful in large farms where the profit from harvesting can more than cover the initial startup cost of buying the harvester. But this type of machine would not be very useful on a small scale farm. You might not be able to recapture the cost of the initial investment. So thus, profits increase in size and, as the size of the farm increases, and small farms are outcompeted by the large ones. These machines also make it inherently easier to make monocropping or harvesting just one crop easier because these machines are developed just to harvest one crop and not many crops. Another aspect of the Green Revolution is irrigation. Irrigation is technology that pumps water into soil. The technology that pumps a lot of water out of the ground made it so that we could grow crops even in the desert. So some environmental impacts, well, this decreases the groundwater much faster than it can be recharged, which can lead to saltwater intrusion, which can lead to waterlogging, which is soil underwater for too long. It'll kill roots due to lack of oxygen, and then salinization, where water is pumped onto land where usually little precipitation falls. That water stays on the surface or stays in the soil and eventually evaporates. Now, this water pumped from the aquifer has trace amounts of salt, and as we're pumping tons and tons of water on top of it, and as that water evaporates, the salt stays behind. And now we started to see that the soil contains so much salt that nothing can grow in it. So that's called salinization. As we can see in this diagram, salinization and waterlogging can sometimes work in tandem. Waterlogged soils evaporate a lot, leave the salt behind, and create poor soils. Fertilizers is another aspect of the Green Revolution. There's three limiting nutrients in most fertilizers. We've talked about nitrogen and phosphorus, and then also potassium. There's two types of fertilizers, organic and inorganic. Organic, made from plants and animals. Inorganic are synthetic, made from industrial processes, like the Haber-Bosch process that we talked about in the omnivore's dilemma. Has allowed us, the synthetic fertilizer has really allowed us to grow a lot more food. Some environmental effects of fertilizer, just like from your final, is a cultural eutrophication. And please review that, make sure you know what cultural eutrophication is. Also, another aspect of the Green Revolution is monocropping, like we mentioned earlier. A single harvested species leads to improved agricultural productivity, but it lessens biodiversity and can eventually degrade the soil if nothing is planted to fix nitrogen back into the soil. Now, the next aspect of the Green Revolution is pesticides. There are two types of pesticides you need to know about, which are insecticides and herbicides. Insecticides kill insects, herbicides kill plants. And then there's broad spectrum pesticides, which apply to kill a whole bunch of different things. And then there's selective pesticides meant to kill one particular organism. Now, DDT was a pesticide introduced in about the mid-1940s through the 50s and into the 60s that was really good at killing mosquitoes. But it also bioaccumulated up the food chain. And bioaccumulation means that when the chemical goes up a trophic level, it concentrates. And as you can see, it goes from 0.0 parts per million and the producer level of the trophic pyramid to one, by the time it got up to this osprey here, it's 13.8 parts per million, which is a lot more. And if at 13.8 parts per million, it started affecting the osprey's ability to incubate their eggs. They started laying eggs with very thin eggshells, which would squish the eggs and kill the young. And it started having all sorts of neurological disorder. Started having a lot of neurological disorders. Rachel Carson, the author of Silent Spring, helped to ban DDT use in the U.S. We still produce it and ship it overseas, but a lot of times pesticides are fat soluble. That means they work within the fat of they are activated within the fat of an organism, and that doesn't go away in the environment very easily. It becomes very persistent. But herbicides, on the other hand, are water soluble and tend to not be as persistent. Pesticides can also lead to what's called the pesticide treadmill. This is another positive feedback loop where when you apply a pesticide, you kill most pests, but the resistant individuals stay around. The proportion of resistant individuals reproduce and produce more pesticide-resistant individuals. So then you go back to apply the pesticide again, but it doesn't kill the pests, so the crop becomes infested with pests, so we develop a new pesticide. So we keep developing stronger and stronger, more resistant populations of pests as we produce more and more new pesticides, called the pesticide treadmill. All right, so that is it for about half of the chapter. If you have any questions, let me know, but let me show you a little bit about what we're going to be spending most of our time with tomorrow. We are going to be, you're going to be working on your Sustainable Supper Lab report. My idea is that you get most of this done in class tomorrow, so you don't have to do a whole lot as homework or beyond this class. So you are going to write this lab report up in your lab notebook. And you are going to learn about how food travels to get to our plate and analyze the environmental impact of this travel in terms of carbon footprint. You can go through and read the background information about carbon footprint and food miles, and then you are going to follow this procedure. You're going to decide on a dish that you want for your sustainable supper. You're going to acquire a copy of the recipe of the dish that you need to make, and then you're going to pick 3 whole food ingredients. Now, when I say whole food, it's something that you can imagine either growing in the ground or walking on land. Some things include carrots, oranges, beef, chicken, rice, corn. Things that are not considered whole foods, think about anything your great-grandmother would not recognize as whole food. So this would be things like monosodium glutamate or thiamine hydrochloride or this one right here, niacinamide. Things like that you don't want to try to trace back because those are probably made in a factory. So I want you to track whole food ingredients, and just as a word of advice, fruits and veggies work better than grains for trying to figure out where it comes from. And meat harvested either by a hunter or from a local farm is a lot easier to trace than meat from a factory farm. Now, some other things to think about. I'm not looking for where the food was distributed. So if you get your food from Publix and tell me that it was grown in Lakeland, Florida, you are incorrect. Lakeland, Florida is where the distributing plant is. And you need to find out where that animal or where that plant grew out of the ground or walked on the ground. So you'll pick the 3 ingredients. In your data section, you will include what is it, where it was grown, name of the farm where it came from or the closest city, and how many miles it took to get to your house. To figure this out, you are going to figure out the carbon footprint for it. To figure this out, you're going to use an online food calculator. Sometimes this link doesn't work, but if you go to Google and Google Food Miles Calculator and select the Food Miles Calculator from the Fallbrook Center, you'll be able to get to the website. So you'll contact the supermarket in order to see where the food came from. If you're having trouble, just pick a different ingredient or pick a different recipe. And then you're going to answer the following analysis questions in your lab book. I gave you some resources to figure it out, and I gave you these data sheets to help you pick out your, record information about your ingredients. Should be a lot of fun. Hopefully you get a big chunk of it done in class, and if you finish it in class, well, then you can work on your homework. So, yeah, good luck, and see you later.